Hello and welcome to the podcast. So, my name is Oscar Clark, and I'm delighted to be joined by Ted Castronova. Ted, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Okay, thanks for having me on, Oscar. My name is Ted Castronova. Right now, I'm a professor of media at a place called Indiana University, which is in beautiful Indiana in the United States, sort of stuck in the corner between the Mississippi River and the Ohio River. So, and I don't know, I made a career out of writing articles and books about virtual economies, especially focusing on games. I really, really like games. And so, I got my start looking at the valuation of coins in games like World of Warcraft and things like that. I also started to write more generally about technology and systems. I've also started to design board games with middling success. And right now, I've really taken a leap off the cliff, and I'm writing a novel. So we'll see how that goes. Probably
That sounds
not
fun. Well, look, I mean, hey, I think we're all been there. I got started in games because I was running role-playing games and designing board games and things like that. And that got me into the industry. And I think actually this board game principle is really key to kind of understanding how we can be really effective, particularly about understanding the balancing in games, the economy in games, and I'm in particular what I'm interested in is the area of system thinking. It's an area I think is underdeveloped, but I'd be interested to know, what do you think is meant by system thinking?
So in terms of defining it, or what kind
Yeah,
of
in terms
mental
of defining
process
it.
are we in when we're doing systems thinking?
All of the above.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, just to give a direct answer, it's the antithesis of linear thinking, where you're following a single train of logic from a start to an end. And in systems thinking, you're trying to understand how different parts work together. And there can be a story there. That is to say, there could be history. There could be, at one moment, the system is in this state, and then at a later time, it's in some other state. I mean, that can happen. But the way you get from A to B with linear thinking is in a sequence of causal events. And with systems thinking, there's causation, but it's so complex. It's forces go into this vibrant electric ball of things that can happen. And then you get an outcome later. But perhaps more interesting than some outcomes from beginning to end is what we call in systems thinking emergent properties. So it's this almost unquantifiable essence of a new thing that can't be traced to any of the particles. So when you're doing systems thinking, you're recognizing that an engine exists. It has existence, right? It is a thing, but you can't trace it to the spark plug and the fuel injector and the pistons. All of those things working together make this thing called the engine. And when that engine-ness impresses itself upon your brain, you have just done systems thinking.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of like the analogy of the black box or the bathtub where you can't see what's in it, and you've got your. I mean, here in the UK, we have this tendency of having a hot and a cold tap rather than a mixer, and so getting the bath at the right temperature with the right flow. Imagining that you don't have a bath plug and you can't see the level, and you've got to make sure the water doesn't run out. This constant spinning of like different parameters and different variables, knowing that you're not in control or aware of all of the information, and yet,
well, and I think,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
I don't know. Just go for it. Yeah.
I was going to say it. Just to kind of push back a little on the black box analogy, the frustrating thing is you can open the black box, and you can walk around inside of it and look at everything and know absolutely everything inside the black box, but you can't really understand what it's doing until you step away and see the whole, to see the emergent part. So in your analogy, it would be, you could watch the hot and cold water flowing in and understand that completely, but you won't really grasp what's going on until you put your foot in the bath and see what temperature that is.
Yes, exactly that.
So you have to see the bath and the hot and the cold as one contained entity, one system.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think what first got me interested in thinking like this is not just playing games, but also for my sins, I did what was called A-level economics, and I was introduced to the ideas of Keynes at the time, and that was the first time that somebody sort of showed me the idea. I mean, whether you're pro or anti-Keynes doesn't matter. I mean, that's not the point. The point for me was the flow that he was trying to show, that it wasn't just a single linear. This happens. It's not just like here's an account accounting system, therefore that's the output. The impact of an investment over here or a charge of a tax over here had
Right.
consequences on the flow overall.
Yeah, that's a
And for
good
me,
economic analysis is a good example. So you can
yeah,
take, and people have, an entire economy, a macro economy with millions of people in it, and hundreds of different sectors, and you can make what's called an input-output table, and
yeah,
you can just show that we produce this much copper, and some of it goes into making wire, and some of it goes into making electrodes, and some of it goes into
yeah.
making cars, and so on and so forth. And you could create that whole table, and then of course it changes. The little numbers change over time, and the problem is you can't possibly predict, even though it's all nice and linear. Right now, it looks like it takes 5 copper to make 1 wire, but
Yeah.
in 30 seconds, it doesn't do that anymore. And so, yeah, like you said, this sort of linear explanation of the economy just doesn't work.
And we try to kind of get some framing of what that might be. So that's why I kind of, again, I'm going to go back to Keynes and the accelerator principle. The idea that if you invest in road building, for example, and that then means that people who build roads have more money, they then are going to do something with that money. And what do? They spend it on other goods and services. And this idea of like, whether you're, on, it doesn't, I mean, I'm trying to avoid sort of, it's not a political thing. It's more simple kind of
No,
trying to
it's
understand
just
the
how things
flow.
work.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's how things work, exactly. And I think it's very much inside a lot of some of the amazing board games that we play, where you're always trying, having one option that you take. Am I going to focus on, gold or wood or food or whatever the particular game has in it? There's a consequence to that decision depending on what the behavior of the other players is quite often. And I think
And
that,
actually, the system itself, even if you're playing certain games, you play them solitaire, and the
absolutely.
system reacts like a living being because it's so complex.
I mean, I can't remember where I first heard about it, but the whole idea of hot dog economics comes to mind to me. And what I mean by that is I think in the US, you get 10 hot dogs and 8 buns. In the UK, we get 6 buns and 8 hot dogs. So it's like slightly different in different territories. But the fact that you never get quite as many buns as you do hot dogs means that you end up going out and buying more buns.
Well, I see. Like if you go to the grocery store, yes, we go to the grocery store. The hot dogs come in units of 6, and the buns come in units of 8.
Yeah. And why? Well, because there's an imbalance. It's a whether it's intentional or not, I'll let you decide. But I think it's interesting as a model. I think particularly in games, because to me it demonstrates that it's not always about balancing all of the moments and the pieces of the puzzle. In fact, in some ways, creating the space in which we can act in order to deal with the imbalance, to deal with the system mechanisms.
Yeah, there's this concept called
exciting.
Dynamic equilibrium that
exactly.
And actually, systems thinking brings up this wonderful idea of equilibrium. And I was just listening to a podcast earlier today, and very bright people, so I have no complaint about them. But one fellow, he's a novelist, and he said, we have to understand that the world is, what is it? It was something like the world is never stable. Water is always running downhill. And I thought, I think that's incorrect. I mean, there are some times when things are in flow, but the idea of balance that you were just talking about, a lot of times there's an equilibrium. So many of the levels that we have in our body, like how much potassium do you have and what's your sugar level? The result of one part of your body doing this and the other part of your body doing that. And they sort of, they kind of go like this, and it's really hard to get your head around that unless, again, you think of it in terms of a system. And I wanted to, yell. I'm yelling at it's like, no, that's not true. There are lakes. There are lakes on mountaintops.
There are spaces. Absolutely.
They're not always flowing down it. So, balance and equilibrium is a big part of like playing games, understanding the equilibrium. And you were referencing the idea that we can affect the equilibria. It's not like when I touch the game, it blows up. I'm just sort of nudging the outcome over in this direction.
Exactly. And I think that part of the energy, the kind of like intrinsic mechanical joy of a game comes in finding that kind of point, that sweet spot between the sort of the dynamic equilibrium balance and the imbalance and how we respond to that. And that imbalance can be in our favor. And there's, obviously we can talk about things like positive feedback loops, negative feedback loops. If we want to get into game theory, we could talk about Nash equilibriums and stuff like that, which I find fascinating. fascinating for other
Uh-huh.
reasons, but it's not really. Well, I don't know. You tell me, but I don't think that's particularly necessary system thinking in itself.
No, I mean, unless you want to define systems thinking as thinking about any human interactions, like
Mm,
if you're going to take a really, really broad definition, then you could
mm,
call a two-player strategic interaction a system.
mm,
But like actually, game theory is a good example of. I mean, it's not exactly linear thinking, but it's close to it.
mm.
So you have two players, and they each have two choices, and you can look at the numbers and sort of say, "Ha, I know this person will do this." That person will do that and we'll
Yeah,
have this outcome.
yeah.
And that
That's not
doesn't
how it
have the
happens.
feel of a system, right? You're just perfectly predicting what's going to happen. Whereas a system has so much unpredictability that you really can
Yeah.
only characterize it through some emergent notion.
Yeah, I think the emergent notion is so important. I mean, for example, those very examples, that kind of prisoner dilemma style thing, I run as a
Mhm.
game. I run as a
Yeah.
kind of podcast game where I
Oh,
put
interesting.
lots of people in these circumstances where if you were to take the logic, yes, I could predict the outcome and it would always
Hmm.
be terrible. But in reality, that's not what happens. In reality,
Yeah.
when you put narrative, when you put characterization around it, and people, probably the most important factor is people actually having that circumstances. It's amazing what does emerge out of it, and it's in those emergent moments that I find we get the most interesting factor.
That's it's one of these cases where the particular personality of the economist prevents him from really understanding the phenomenon he's trying to
Mm,
study. And
mm,
what I'm talking about here is in order to fully analyze the prisoner's dilemma as a logical matter, as a matter of
yeah,
logical choices, you have to be very good at forming a pure hypothetical in your mind and
yeah,
closing out everything. Right. So,
mm,
yeah. What I know this, and you probably do too, from trying to teach game theory to students over many, many years. You're saying, okay, we have player A, player B, and each has choice X or Y, and it results in these payoffs 1, 2, 3, 4. And some students, maybe most of them, have incredible difficulty thinking about that situation just by itself
yeah,
because they say, well, it wouldn't be fair for player one to do that. And it's like, no, there's no fairness here, right? The numbers in the cells are totally and completely describe all of their payoffs. Any number of people, like, they just can't do that. Whereas economists are very good at it. Economists would
exactly,
predict this certain outcome because they assume that everyone would approach this system in a completely faultless,
completely logical way.
hypothetical. Whereas, as you point out, when you actually put people through it, they bring in all kinds of assumptions into these situations.
And I think this is where we can kind of bring it back to games, because I think this is
Mhm.
one of the risks we face when if we say adopt a linear mindset to the way we're trying to look at a game design, or even when we take a system approach, but we forget the human and emergent factors. So I'll be really interested to see when you talk about kind of helping people with kind of like thinking about game theory. When you're looking at kind of economics, applying particularly system thinking to the game economics, I should clarify what I mean by that. So when I'm talking about game economics, I'm talking about a range of experiences from in-game behaviors. So I do something, I get a reward. That
Mhm.
reward might have, well, I don't want to get too deep because I want to see what you think and how you would approach it. But game has a reward, has a thing. Those rewards are exchangeable for other things. There may be
Mhm.
other things yet that I might also invest external resources, i.e. cash or more time or watch an ad or whatever. So there's an exchange process as well as the play process. Anyway, that's kind of what I mean by the economy of a game, the whole gamut. So
Mhm.
with that in mind, you're talking about game theory with people. How would you kind of help people understand the value or the usefulness of a system thinking approach?
So, systems thinking approach as applied to, uh, like, say, trying to design those sorts of experiences.
Exactly.
Well, I think it's essential
Hmm.
because there's this thing, the law of unintended effects, and you are trying to design a system that meets certain criteria, like you don't want it to break. And you can define breaking in a number of different ways. But I mean, it's in the nature of exchange, of human
Hmm.
exchange, that things can blow up very quickly. So,
Hmm.
what I mean by that specifically is the action of one player causes some reaction by any number of players, which then causes another reaction by an even larger number, and things can go crazy. And you don't want that.
Mm.
And so you have to think about sort of holistically about, okay, what happens if all of my players do this? So there's that sort of global perspective you need to have, but you also need to have what would I call it? Like a strategy evolution
Mm.
idea in your head as well. So here's an interesting kind of system that humans can get into is you have a bunch of people who are playing the game in a certain way. What if one of them says, I'm going to try playing it this other way. And then they encounter people local to them who see that new approach and like, oh, I'm going to do that too. And that strategy spreads. So suddenly this game that you were getting this sort of performance out of, now you're getting this other performance, not because you changed anything and not because there was like a mass psychosis or something, but rather an idea invaded people's brains and spread. So it's like more of a disease sort of model. And really, in order to think about the two ways you would respond to those two situations. So one of them I said was sort of global and holistic. So you'd want to design the entire system so that the group as a whole is going to operate in one way. But the other one, you have to design every player's local incentives so that they don't, hit upon that other strategy, or when they think of it and then they try it out, it turns out it doesn't work that well. So it's a matter of like, and I'll give a perfectly practical example of this. At the global level, you have to have faucets that bring a currency in, and you have to have drains that bring a currency out. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's sort of a global thing. But at a local level, right, you have to make sure there are no situations where a player can purchase an item over here and then take it over here and sell it for more. Like you can't have a merchant that sells an apple for 1 gold and another merchant that buys it for 2 gold. As you think about the local incentives there, once one player starts doing it, they're all doing it. So you have to pay attention to the choice environment of each individual, but then also the inflows and outflows for this whole system at the same time.
I mean, over here we use the term sink and source. Well, I use the term sink and source for the same thing you're describing as faucets and drains. It's the same thing. It's the classic Oscar Wilde line of 2 countries divided by a common language. So I love that line. So, but this is the thing. So from a practical point of view, what we're doing is we're looking at kind of those sources, those faucets of whatever the kind of currency, the resource, the mechanism that we're gaining as a reward. But equally, we have to be bearing in mind how they're utilized, and whether that's a single drain or sink, or some other kind of method. Whether it might be, classic examples might be, I'm going to have a hat of wonder. The hat of wonder requires a blueprint, it requires some wool, and it requires some gold. So if I'm going to have the blueprint, I've got to have probably done some sort of mission or something to unlock that. To get the wool, I probably have to go and harvest something, and the gold I can probably pick up through multiple tasks. Those very things individually carry different incentives in terms of play of the game itself, and also have and also have other payoffs in terms of like personal narrative in gameplay as well. Is that kind of the model we're talking about here?
Yeah, well, you would have, I guess my point would be, you'd have to pay attention to absolutely every one of those variations, all the different ways. Like, let's just take the gold part of it. You mentioned there are a number of different ways of getting gold. Well, one way would be to receive gold accompanying the quest that you needed to do to get the other thing. So that's the idea of sort of rewarding people directly with gold for their actions. You can have gold coming in through killing a monster. For some reason, every rat in the early modern era carried copper coins.
Of course it does, and pieces of armor apparently as well. Somehow,
yeah, it's a known thing.
Yeah,
and their whiskers are actually worth money. There are merchants in town who will purchase endless.
I blame Meridian 59. Yes, I'm that old. I played that.
And each one of those things. So, but let's say you're the designer and you put all those things in there to facilitate the creation of this hat of wonder. That's great, but money kind of doesn't disappear necessarily. It flows around.
Yeah.
So that you have this junior designer making all these quests and dropping these massive gold rewards, and someone else is saying, why is there so much? I planned on there being only so and so much gold in the players' pockets, and they have massively more gold. Where did that come in from? So yeah, you do have to pay attention to really every aspect of the individual player. And there are ways, actually, since I don't work in the game industry, I don't know precisely what these are,
Mm.
but I know there are behind the scenes metrics, let's say. So how do I determine how much gold is required to get the Hat of Wonder? Well, I have to have some kind of internal quantitative assignment of value to the Hat of Wonder. Like the Hat of
Yes.
Wonder is worth like 100 power points, whereas the
Mm.
Sword of Wonder is worth 200. And
Yeah.
then the designers have to sort of base the difficulty of all the quests and the gathering and so on and so forth relative to those things, because otherwise how would you balance it? You could have something that is very, very difficult to make or acquire, and yet it doesn't benefit the players in any way, or whereas
No,
this
no,
other
exactly.
thing's incredibly easy and makes them very powerful. So you need to have some sort of behind the scene a set of metrics about what's the use of the items, how powerful are they, and how difficult are they to get.
When I mean, I'm going to go in detail in the book a little bit about some other ways of doing that. So we have things like
Mm,
anchor currencies. So an anchor
mhm,
currency is essentially a variable that can only be obtained through play that you use as a way of fixed price fixing, essentially.
mhm,
So any
mhm,
other exchange you can vary, but as long as you know what the anchor currency level is, you know how
right.
the rate at which that drops, and therefore
Mhm,
you can prevent kind of the worst excesses in some
mhm,
cases.
mhm,
So that's kind of a
mhm,
nice one. Ratchets is another one I tend to use. By ratchet, I mean a kind of something that locks you in step. So this is like the
mhm,
blueprint. I have to have completed a particular quest to have that
mhm,
particular blueprint, and therefore I
mhm,
know you have done that thing. But equally, it
mhm,
might be you can't use the Hat of Wonder until you're level 10. So
mhm,
I know then I've got a different variable that might be experience points or something similar, and therefore I've got another way to cap my. Because what we're talking about here is, as you said, you're going to have a set of rules, you have an understanding of what's going on, but are there techniques we can use to cap the complexity and
mhm.
still have the flavor? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I have to answer that yes, because I firmly believe, since I've gotten more interested in board games, that there's this feeling that if we increase complexity and reality and all these things, that the player experience will improve. And
Mm.
it turns out that's not true. It's
No.
really an art, right? So capping the complexity is not only something we ought to be able to do, but we should do it, right?
Mm.
Because the goal here isn't to have like the most intricate economy with the let's say the most number of goods, but to have one that just feels so wonderful. Now, as it
Yes.
happens, the best feeling economies are ones that do have, let's say, thousands of items in them and so on. So the for the most part, players of the larger games they're not upset at all at having lots of items. But if you take like little games that are extremely satisfying, like Faster Than Light or Plants
Mm.
vs Zombies,
Yeah.
I mean that's not a complex field of items that can be purchased or acquired, but they feel really good. They all make
Yeah.
perfectly good sense.
And they
So.
have challenges inherent in
Mhm,
balancing them. And I think that's what's so
mhm,
fascinating,
mhm,
particularly the games like FTL, where the designers have thought not about kind of like making the biggest experience possible, but making every point of the decision making the thing that
mhm,
matters. If
mhm.
that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's just we can't when we're talking about game systems, we can never get away from the art. Right?
Yeah.
Ultimately, it's a matter of understanding the psychology of the player and the kind of experiences you want the player to have, any kind of aesthetic goal
Mm.
that you have with the creation. And the economy has to be in service to all of that. And I think it's
Mm.
wonderful, as a kind of what I would consider myself to be kind of a creative economist. Does that make
Mm.
sense? But
Mm.
because I like the idea of the economy exists to make people happy, not rich, happy.
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds good to me.
Yeah, and I really enjoy it when you see in the game someone who's devoted time to having the acquisition and allocation and production of goods be so satisfying,
Mm.
and
Mm.
so the art of it is,
Well, it becomes
it's just
joyful if you
very
have
impressive.
that. I think is that there's a sort of cognitive resonance when
Mm,
you understand or you find a pattern that you can resolve that then gives you
mm,
the output that lets you progress your character and
mhm,
understanding.
mhm,
I think it's an interesting for me because I think there's a level of ambiguity that a system approach to design gives you, but at the same time, a certainty, if you make sense. So,
Yeah. No,
we're thinking about flow. I mean, you current, yeah.
that comment you just made makes me reflect on something I felt about music for a long time. For a
Mm,
long time, thinking about what is so satisfying about music. Why is really good music feel good? And I thought, and I don't know if this is true, and I haven't really read it up on it, but I thought music. What it does is it sets up an expectation, and then it resolves it in an unexpected way. And
mm,
that is what really, really feels so good. And
mm,
with systems design, like the very, very best systems design would set up an expectation, let's say, about the use of an item.
yeah,
And let's say the item is called like the sword of dragon killing. And
yeah.
it's kind of satisfying when you then encounter a dragon and kill the dragon. But it's even cooler when you keep going through and say, I haven't encountered a dragon. There are no dragons here. And then it turns out that, there's a deadly mosquito and his name is Dragon. You kill him with this, right? Or some sort of
Yeah, yeah.
unexpected way that the sword of dragon killing comes useful
Becomes useful
and
in a
validates
different
all
way.
the
Yeah.
money and expense you put to it. It can also be actually quite funny. I remember there was a game. It was one of the old PlayStation games, and it was about killing aliens and um hordes and hordes of aliens. You had your spaceships, and it was kind of cartoony and fun and childish. And there were items you could unlock. Great. So, you go about trying to unlock the items. You had to gather so and so much resource, then you unlock another. And the ones that you didn't have were presented to you in sort of a silhouette. You couldn't tell quite what they were. But the name would be under it. So some of them sound really cool. Like, the Abracadabra 67Z. I wonder what that does. You're trying to find.
Yeah.
And one of the very highest ones was called Horn. And
Mm.
it's like, oh, man, what is this thing going to be? This is like you're going to put this thing on and it's going to blast this sound. It's just going to destroy something. Because it was third from the top. It was amazing.
Yeah.
And you're working hard. I get Horn. I put it on my ship and I go, okay, let's see what this bad boy does. And I press the button and it goes, awooga.
Yeah. Love
And
it.
you had to laugh.
It just makes a noise. I love that. Yeah.
It was hilarious. Although, you failed that mission because you needed 3 good weapons on there. You had 2 good weapons and all.
But there's an interesting aspect to that though. I think, what I love is when you're smart about that. So you have something like that, you throw in this thing that's technically not useful. And this is something I look at in terms of handicap. So we're not very good at when we do design, we often end up giving the person who gets the best results the best stuff.
Mhm.
So particularly in a multiplayer game, that means the people who are already good get even better, making it
Yeah.
harder for you to play with those people again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whereas I like the idea of you deliberately taking on a handicap. Maybe I choose to take the horn in order to mean that when I play you next, it gives me a score multiplier.
Yeah.
So it makes my job harder, but I get better results.
There's a couple thoughts about that. One is the difficulty of encouraging role play, which the online multiplayer games, they never really solved that.
No.
And it was one of the big disappointments of my life because I thought, oh, this is going to be so cool. This is going to be like a massive D&D game where everyone is acting in character. And it turns out absolutely the opposite of that. And they never figured out a way to get people to act within the parameters of the culture of the world and all those things. And they did try different things, but it just doesn't work. It works at the tabletop level is the GM can be there and
oversee.
Have the god do mean things to you if you don't kind of settle down.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I know that there are some great RPG servers out there where people do try that, but you're right. There's no inbuilt necessity.
Right. That was the great hope that you could do it mechanically or with code that people would. But it turns out no. It's a community thing, right? So I think what is it in Lord of the Rings Online, the Landroval server, which was heavily role play in like 2009, and then I came back 6, 7, 8 years later and still there, still a good role playing community, and that was really, really wonderful.
It's fantastic when you get that community dedicated to that experience. I'm also very impressed with people like EVE Online. I mean, where the whole premise is very cutthroat, but it's also the context. So the natural
it's like people
play.
I call it involuntary role play. Where you set up a system where people act in accord with their character and they're not even thinking about it. They don't have to be good actors or anything. And in
Yeah.
EVE Online, it just attracts these people who like being cutthroat, and boom,
Yeah.
it just
Boom.
works perfectly.
And the economy kind of works with that because they have an actual
Hmm.
economy where
Yeah.
there is loss of
Yeah.
your earnings through the depreciation of your
Hmm.
equipment.
And
And I
yeah,
think,
and
yeah.
it brought out all of the very realistic actions, including fraud and
Mm,
theft, and it's like that's it, man. That's a real thing.
yeah, it's a real thing, and it's game it's in the game. It's
Yeah.
I was talking to one of the designers of Eve out in Poznan recently, and they had a tough call to make. Do they, when that big battle happened, which wiped out so many people, do
Hmm.
you make that the thing or not?
Yeah.
And in the end, they essentially made the call to make it a thing.
Yeah, and I think that's the
And
right call. That took a lot of
yeah,
bravery, but in the long run, I mean, it just sort of validates their design choice. And and it's another thing is it makes the virtual world better than the real world, because in the real world,
yeah,
when we have a banking crisis, what happens? The rich people all get bailed out.
yeah, yeah, exactly, yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I think that's, yeah, like you say, there's a natural balance that makes that feel quote unquote fair, whatever that means. I mean,
Hmm.
obviously there's a
Yeah.
whole different conversation to be had about what
Hmm.
fair means, the different state. So let's go into a bit more kind of the kind of primeval kind of economic elements of a game. So if
Okay.
somebody is looking at a game, I think this, we've talked a little bit about exchange. We've talked a little bit about utilities. We haven't used the word utility, but what I
Hmm.
mean by utility are those resources, those currencies.
Sure.
Some
Yeah.
of those are forms of exchange in themselves. Some of them are items. Some of those items can be upgraded. Are there
Hmm.
kind of like ways that, when you talk to people about this or you thought about this, are there sort of basic principles about what kinds and forms and types of these resources in the exchange methods? Are there any kind of base principles that people should think about?
And that's interesting. So I'm not quite sure kind of what the domain of the question is. So whether it's, like gold, a currency is certainly one of
Yeah,
those.
yeah,
There's almost always some sort of energy type resource,
mhm,
like something that it's like a fuel, like you have to pour it into something
yeah,
else or it doesn't work and it gets
exactly.
consumed. So that's like a
Yes.
consumable. But then there are also durables
Mm,
that never take damage, but you get rid of them because they do have some cash value when you sell it,
right.
and they get superseded by something of higher quality.
Yeah.
So those basic breakdowns of private goods are all in there, like, just currency, a consumable, and a durable. Those are like the
Mm,
three core elements. What you don't see too much is the other goods types, which are like public goods, right? You
yeah.
don't often see something that one player makes that all the players benefit from,
Mm, mm,
and you don't see that. And if you did see that, you'd want to also see some way for other players to contribute to that public good, some
mm,
sort of. And I think that's a unexplored and fascinating area for
mm,
community building, is things like public
definitely.
goods. But there are also, I think, another thing that would be really fun would be common pool resources, which is
Yeah,
sort
yeah,
of in another quadrant where, there's a lake, but if we all fish in the lake, all the fish are going to die.
yeah.
And so then the community, they're always looking for ways of creating community. Boy, if you have this incredibly important common pool resource, you're going to get community really, really fast. Especially if you have like nations fighting against one another, you're going to get this situation where people are going to say, "Stop fishing. You have to get away from there." Right? We all get to fish for 10 minutes a day, and
Yeah.
nobody gets to fish any more than that. And it would all be enforced through, social stigma and norms. So, I mean, just the basic currency, consumable, durable is mostly what you see, and you don't see too many of the other more interesting types of goods like airwaves or, like I said,
Oh, what's
forests or
airwaves? I don't know that one.
that's the public good thing, right? Anyone can
I see.
broadcast on the airway, but you have to
Oh, I
build
see
a
what you
radio
mean.
station.
Generally, yeah, yeah, yeah. Gotcha. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So
like the air is
this is
free,
the
right?
this is the bandwidth.
Yeah, yeah,
This
yeah.
is the 300 megahertz frequency,
Right,
which I
right.
think that was the frequency that Hutchison Whampoa bought for like 3 billion in the
Yeah.
UK, or something
Yeah, I,
ridiculous.
I don't
I
know what it is
was,
there, but here, all
yeah,
of our broadcasters are using.
yeah,
Back in the 20s, they all got access for free,
yeah,
and they've
yeah,
been
yeah.
using it ever since. And there's some speculation now. It's like, well, that'd be a good source of revenue. Make those suckers
Mm.
pay for it. But
Well,
again, you
yeah,
don't you
that's
don't
what
really
happens
see
with
that
phone
kind of
companies. They
stuff.
pay for bandwidth.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
another kind of good you don't see too often in games is financial goods, insurance,
Oh, yeah. Oh,
loans,
insurance
things
is
like
an
that.
interesting
And
one.
and I think
Yeah.
they're just too complicated, but it could be interesting.
I think one of my favorite, there was a panel at a Casual Connect many years ago. I think it was Toy Vaderman who did the evil monetization panel. And they talked about Minecraft insurance policies.
Yeah.
So you'd pay for insurance if somebody destroyed your building on the server. I mean, I think that's
That would make
hilarious.
money in Eve, I think,
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
Insure your ship.
Yeah. Honestly, I can definitely see that. I think there's a whole bunch of things like that. So, I mean, things I actually am. I think if you look at things like depreciation, of goods,
Hmm.
I think there's something about items degrading through use, which we're used to in
Hmm.
games, but
Hmm.
haven't necessarily always been integrated into the natural feel of the game.
Right.
Which,
Well,
again, to me, that's
my
another form
impression
of
is I've always heard that it's tedious. That any
yeah,
kind of sort of natural degradation process always, instead of, like, what are the ways you could do it? You could have the item decays until it finally breaks and they have to buy a new one, or you could have the item decaying and they have to go somewhere to get it repaired, and
yeah.
there's just tedium involved with that.
Hmm.
So,
But the counter argument to that is if it's a crafting thing and crafting is joyful.
mhm,
If crafting is joyful, it has to be joyful, otherwise it
mhm,
doesn't work.
yeah.
But yeah, but I
Well,
think these
then
sorts
now
of
that's another problem. We haven't really talked
yeah,
about production.
go for it. Yeah,
Nobody's really come up with a way that where crafting is actually a satisfying activity. It
mm,
has to be a boring time sink or people would do too much of it. And nobody's really squared that circle. It's like
yeah.
every crafting system involves just sitting there, waiting for the bar to go down. And so it's kind of hard to determine what is fun about owning a business and making something. And typically it's a direct hands-on satisfaction where, because of the way you turn the lathe, the banister is just absolutely beautiful. And because of the way you
Yeah.
cut the leather, the shoe is beautiful. And I haven't really seen anybody capture that sort of
There
aesthetic.
there've
And
been a
so it's
few
just the satisfaction of a business
yeah.
in most crafting systems is really just, I do this boring thing for a long time, but I get a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, there have been a few systems that have made it enjoyable. I mean,
Mm.
even Skyrim, which I'm a huge fan of, I
Mhm,
spent an inordinate amount of time gathering flowers on mountainsides and making
mhm,
potions,
mhm,
and
mhm.
probably way more than I ever needed to.
Yeah.
But
Actually, there was a
but
game called Kingdom Come that I spent
yeah,
so much time figuring out alchemy. It was really, and they had what, because I'm a history buff, a lot of us are.
mm,
They had an alchemical laboratory that felt to me like it was pretty close to the way it would really be.
okay.
Like, you had to pour these things in, and it was neat.
I mean, again, this is the thing. Is like I think we're saying here is that there are some core principles about approach. There are key logical systems that we can leverage, but
Hmm.
understanding that they have emergent properties, and those properties aren't just in the numbers; they're in
Hmm.
the experiential aspect.
Yeah.
They're in the
In the sense
they're
of
in
satisfaction.
sense of satisfaction.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
And I've said for many years that this is sort of an unexplored dimension of human psychology, and that academics will never discover this because the the people who make games are tinkering constantly with human psychology. And so all
Yeah.
the major breakthroughs about the human mind and human action, human behavior are going to emerge from the game space. I mean, there's
Mm.
just no question in my mind. And that's when I really started, I just shifted all of my research focus. I stopped reading papers in social science because I thought these, they're based on weird research methods and there's so much incentive to get it wrong in a way that's acceptable to the journals and all this. Whereas the people in the game industry, they have one and only one incentive, which is to get it right, right?
Yeah.
Whoever has the better model of the human mind is going to do better in
Mm.
games. I'm not saying they may exploit, which is not good, but
No.
they will certainly, it's to their benefit to have a good sense of it. And so these frontiers of exactly how do people want to have an economy crafted so that they feel wonderful within that system. Just think if that were discovered and we could translate it and bring it out and put it into the real world, can you imagine having an economy in the real world that actually makes people feel satisfied and happy? It may not make them rich, but again, we don't want it. It's, there are plenty of rich people who are miserable.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
can we
Plenty
do
of them.
something? Yeah. Can we, making enough money to live on is something we all have to do. So
Yeah.
can we make that also satisfying?
And I think, and again, this is where because I'm coming at it trying to work out how to effectively, trying to make a case that an ethical approach to monetization is more enduring
Hmm.
because my hypothesis, and we're yet to see if I prove it in the book, we'll find out, is
Hmm.
that the longer you feel satisfied, the more you'll continue playing. The more
Oh,
you continue
absolutely. It's an
playing,
engagement metric.
yeah, the more you continue playing, the more you're likely to want to invest, whether that's time or money or both.
Yeah. Well, yeah, if they can solve this problem, I don't know if it's a problem. If they can make uh advances on this frontier and come up with ways for people to have all kinds of actions within systems that make them happy, yes, you're going to get more engagement. And if you think about it, gaming as it is, it's really concentrated among younger people. What happens if they start figuring out ways of satisfying people across the age groups? I mean, the social revolutions that are available, and I'm not saying that all these social changes would be excellent and wonderful and that we want them, but I'm saying that's the frontier, and that's what could happen because people go in and they work their jobs.
Yeah.
What if it turns out they could earn like a half of that money and have way more fun in some kind of crafted video game type experience? That just think about the earthquake that would cause. And,
Exactly.
you know,
Well, people feeling satisfied and able to, because I think, most of us aren't just focused on cash. We actually
mhm,
want to enjoy
mhm,
the fact that we have lives,
right.
in my
Yeah.
view. So, to sum this up, so I mean, we've been talking about system thinking and its application. We're talking about the fact that games aren't just processes and numbers. But
Mhm,
the more we ignore the emergent properties, the more risk we are at having a broken game for
right.
various ways. So,
Right.
what's the kind of, if you were to sort of sum up for a listener or for a reader, what are the important factors that you would recommend a designer to think about when looking at their economy? What would they be?
Yeah. So this is actually one of those questions that has no good answer. It involves having your system already built and having 100,000 players already in it. And then once you get there, then you can start being careful that your system works. 'Cause
Yeah.
you can't really know. The biggest question I get in my consulting is where should
Yeah.
the prices start?
Yeah.
So they build an economy and it has 77,000 different items in it, and they have sources and sinks for their currency, gold, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And they're like, what should we put as the initial uh, price of oranges? Because they understand it's going to adjust, but where do you start? And that's a question that doesn't have any answer. The beginnings of our price system are buried in ancient Sumeria, okay, and every price has evolved since then. So this issue of like starting an economy from nothing, that's very much a 21st century problem. So I guess maybe being ready to change lots of things would be,
Mm.
you just, I do have some ideas about like how do you anchor, where do you start? But those are a little bit harder to explain. But the thing that I think you could put like in book form or epigram at the end of a show like this is all this stuff about the evolution of prices. Creating specialization so that people have an incentive to trade. We said before, making sure that you have drains for all of your sources and making sure that people's incentives are right. I think that's not too hard to communicate. What's a little bit harder to communicate is how to launch. And,
Yeah.
and that set of thinking is about something that goes back to the idea you mentioned, which was the idea of an anchor currency, right? The currency you can only get
Mm.
by actually working in the game. So that actually, I think, unlocks a bunch of stuff about where you start when you launch an economy. Because that thing, the anchor currency, it's telling you, it's forcing the players to think about the value of their own time. Okay. So the anchor currency is if they don't like the game at all, let's just imagine that, this is how much time it takes for a player to get 100 gold pieces, right, in the
Yeah.
anchor currency. And then that's directly related to, the value of their time in the outside world. And you can assume that the value of people's time in the outside world is fixed, and you have fixed the rate at which this gold can be obtained using that time. All right,
Yeah.
now you have something firm, okay? And
Yeah.
you can just internally say, okay, I want an orange to cost a half an hour of someone's time, and then that tells you how to price it.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
right. So you ultimately you launch the game by thinking about what's the value of their time. Or
Yeah.
and kind of there's another wrinkle, another way to look at it is how skilled are people,
Yes,
right? They're
okay. Yes,
a
yes.
person's basic ability to move pixels around on a screen once they understand how a system works, that's not going to change too much. So that's another way. Is how skillful does a person have to be to get an orange?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
another way to think of it. So that's really, that those are kind of the key rules for launching, and then after that, it's about paying attention to local incentives and global inflows and outflows.
Perfect. On that note, Ted, thank you very much for your time. That's been
Sure.
great. Really
Yeah,
appreciate
thanks,
it.
Oscar.
And I'll leave it there.